Hello, in this video I will be repairing the speedometer for this car. The speedometer is not showing how fast the car is going, and that is what I will be trying to fix. The speedometer needle is stuck and stays at 0 miles per hour. This is an older car, so the speedometer is different compared to the newer cars, and so the speedometer is ran by a cable connected to the transmission. Before determining if the speedometer is the part in need of replacement, I checked the cable to see if the cable was functioning. Before I fully removed the cable, I hand turned the needle in the cable to see if it was turning at the other end of the cable. In other words, I checked to see if the cable was functioning, which it clearly was not working in this case. I partially removed the cable and hand turned the spindle in the cable to see if the inner parts of the cable are working, and that showed me that it was time to replace the cable. This is the new part that I will be replacing over the old one. I got this part online. I'll put a link in the description below. It is an older part, so it might be hard to get this part at a local parts store. But if it is available at the parts store, that can be an option to where to get it. Removing the instrument cluster on this car is straightforward. There are 5 Phillips screws holding down the outer part of the cover for the instrument cluster. There are 3 screws at the top and 2 screws near the bottom of the cover, and the 2 screws near the bottom are somewhat hidden. The 2 screws are not in plain sight and are facing the floor. The hazard light switch is attached to the outer cover of the instrument cluster. In order to fully remove the cover, the hazard light switch needs to be disconnected from the rear of the switch. Once it's disconnected, the cover can come right off. Once the outer cover is out, the instrument cluster will expose 4 Phillips screws holding it down. The 4 screws locations are very obvious and in plain sight, and it just requires a Phillips screwdriver for removal. Once the screws are out, the cluster will be free to be removed. It is a little bit of a tight squeeze for the cluster when being removed, so I did have to be careful not to damage any plastic, especially since the plastic on the cluster is very old. Everything on this car is old, so be careful when removing anything. There are a couple of connections connected to the rear of the cluster. These will have to be removed as well. Here is one end of the speedometer cable, and this end connects to the instrument cluster. This is the other end of the cable, which you can use an adjustable wrench to remove it. This end attaches to a shaft where the shaft connects to the transmission. The shaft and cable can be removed as one part, but if you were to only replace the cable, the shaft with gear can be left on the transmission. To remove just the cable, you use an adjustable wrench to remove it. In this part, I just removed the cable by itself from the transmission. I did run into some problems, so I ended up removing the cable along with the shaft and gear that the cable attaches to. The shaft is really the part that attaches to the transmission. The speedometer cable attaches to the shaft, and then the shaft with gear attaches to the transmission. As you can see here, this pointy thing, this is what turns and spins and sends the movement to the speedometer. Here is the cable where right before it enters the interior of the car. This is the firewall of the car. The cover here is held down by 3 screws. To remove the speedometer cable, it might require some going back and forth and out of the car and back into the engine bay to remove the cable. I had to move the cable around and wiggle it around back and forth in the car to loosen the cable. Like I mentioned earlier, there can be a lot of back and forth and in and out of the car to remove the cable. You might have to pull some cable out from inside of the engine bay, then you might have to push some cable out from inside of the car, and you might have to do this back and forth. When the old cable is out, the new cable is ready to be installed. So this is the shaft that I mentioned earlier. This is the shaft that connects to the transmission and where the speedometer cable connects to. I did have some problems when connecting the new cable to the transmission. The cable was loose when I attached it to the shaft, so I put an O-ring underneath the fastener of the cable to create a snug fit. Before putting the O-ring, the cable would wiggle around. It felt loose and had a lot of free play, and it just didn't feel stable. Depending on where you get the parts, just remember that parts can vary in quality. Sometimes the prices are really good, but the quality might not be so good, which can be true in this case. You just get what you pay for, and this part just wasn't a perfect fit for the car, and it did have to be adjusted. The cable I bought was actually very long. It was longer than the original cable. It wasn't a perfect match of the cable, so I had to wrap it around this random hole underneath the car before attaching the cable to the transmission. If I didn't do this, the cable was long enough that it would touch the ground and also touch the exhaust pipes. I didn't want the cable catching onto something while driving or getting burned because it was touching the exhaust pipes. And so, to avoid this, I wrapped the cable around this hole before going to the transmission. Now that the new cable is installed, I'm going to be installing the rest of the parts back on, such as the instrument cluster and covers. Reinstallation is straightforward. I just reconnected the connectors on the back of the cluster. I screwed the 4 screws holding the cluster, and then I reinstalled the cluster's cover. Before securing the cluster down, remember to put the hazard light switch back on and make sure it's connected. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to all of the subscribers. I really appreciate it. I hope that you find this video helpful in your repairs. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video.